Hey everyone, welcome to episode 46. This is the fourth episode in my series on the biomes of the planet Earth. In the previous episode, I explored the dry, hot biomes of savanna and desert. But this episode, I'm going to shift gears and explore the dry, cold of the northern biomes, the boreal forests of the taiga, the vast plains of tundra, and the polar ice caps. The northernmost regions of the world are all exposed to a long, extremely cold winter season, which gets longer the farther north you are, and a short, hot summer, which gets shorter as you go north as well. These seasonal climate extremes are by far the most influential factor in the evolution and ecology of the life that lives here. Cycles between plant dormancy and rapid growth, blooming times, animal migration, breeding, and calving seasons, pretty much everything is based on and dependent on the seasonal climates. That's how important it is. That's why it's the very first thing I have to say about life in the north. To begin, I'll start with the taiga, which is a vast, collective biome of all the boreal forests and spotty subtundra forests, which altogether form a ring between 50 and 70 degrees latitude on the planet's northern hemisphere. Besides the oceans, the taiga is geographically the largest biome on the planet, which necessarily makes it the largest biome on dry land, larger even than all of the deserts in the Sahara, the Arabian Peninsula, and the western Australian outback combined. In North America, the taiga stretches from Alaska all the way across Canada into the northern reaches of Minnesota, New York, and Maine. In Europe, the taiga covers most of Norway and Sweden and nearly all of Finland. Taiga covers the entire upper third of the Asian continent, spreading from the plains northeast of Moscow across Siberia to the Pacific Ocean, where the taiga reaches as far as the Kamchatka Peninsula and even Hokkaido, the northernmost island of Japan. The taiga forests are dominated by conifers, trees that grow seeds encased in the layers of a cone, like a pine cone. These plants are really sturdy, capable of withstanding the intense cold of northern winters, and capable of living and growing in the thin soils with their low water content and their minimal nutrients. And if this wasn't difficult enough for most plants to handle, the taiga forest soil is also remarkably acidic. Most of the conifers that cover the taiga have little needles, like spruce needles and pine needles, that kind of thing. And as these age and dry out, they fall off of the tree and they litter the forest floor. These dry, dead needles contain numerous acidic biochemicals, and when all the needles slowly decay, the acidic biochemicals leach into the soil. It contributes to the acidity of the soil. Because of the relatively high soil acidity, the few species that can tolerate it tend to be lichens and mosses, and of course the pine and spruce trees themselves, which help produce the acidic effect. By reacidifying the soil they grow in with the old dry needles they drop, which then goes on to optimize their own growth, these taiga trees are, in a way, self-sustaining. They've evolved to fit quite nicely into their subarctic habitats. This can be dangerous for a tree because if snow builds up on a branch, the weight can bend, deform, or actually break the branch off. For conifer trees and boreal forests, their branches are covered in thin needles, which makes all of their fronds and branches kind of like giant fuzzy fingers. And so unlike normal leaves, which are thin and weak and can't hold up that much snow in the first place, these pine-covered fronds are able to hold a ton of snow. Snow can weigh down the branches and harm the tree. This is an evolutionary pressure, and it shaped the conifers to be tall and narrow, or tall and cone-shaped, with downward sloping branches, and this encourages snow to fall off. If too much snow accumulates on the branch, it won't be able to hold its own weight up on the slope of the tree, and so the snow will just slide off. And that takes a lot of pressure off of the tree, and it prevents it from getting hurt. Trees also have a chemical mechanism to harden their cells and their tissues against the cold, and they initiate this chemical sequence before every winter. Virtually every part of their physiology has been shaped by evolution. The use of needles instead of leaves helps to limit water loss through transpiration, which is really important in the drier, continental climates of the north. These needles are dark green, suggesting highly concentrated chloroplasts that absorb as much light as possible. That's pretty important when, for a quarter to half of the year, the sun barely rises above the horizon. The needles also stay on the tree year-round. They aren't shed seasonally like most other trees, and that's because they're kind of nutritionally expensive to produce, to grow. And if the trees don't have access to that many nutrients in the first place, they can't really afford to just shed their needles every season. So they hang on to the ones they have through years and years and years. And after a while, the older ones dry out and fall off, but new ones are slowly made. This is also why they're called evergreens, because they're green forever, I guess, or all year. These forests can be densely packed with trees in the southern regions of the taiga, where it's warmer and generally more humid and more friendly for larger vegetation. The southern border forests of the taiga are also called intermediate forests, or mixed temperate forests, with various species of tree like oak, elm, and maple. All the spruce and firs and pines are conifers. These conifer forests are common in the populated parts of Canada, across most of Alaska, and in much of western Russia. In eastern Russia, there's a deciduous tree species called a larch, and these dominate in some of the coldest areas on the populated continents. These densely packed trees make a closed canopy forest, and it can be so dense that all of the overlapping branches of the trees will create a three-dimensional maze for squirrels and birds. These mazes can be really difficult for larger animals to move through, and it gives squirrels and nesting birds numerous opportunities for making or finding shelter and enjoying a safe woodland home, like literally within the grasp of all of these branches of these thick trees. For the largest animals, like bears and moose, the trees pretty much form an impassable barrier. The thicker taiga forest isn't a totally impenetrable carpet of trees, though. While some regions are really dense, like a forested mountain valley, a lot of the taiga is patchy. Stands of trees are scattered across a grassy field or a moss-covered hillside, with the flat open land between the trees. These open areas are choked with grasses, mosses, and various species of flowers, like fireweed, and berry plants like blueberry, strawberry, and cranberry. The open areas also create a kind of travel corridor for migrating mammals like deer or caribou, or wandering animals like moose, and territorial animals like bears and wolves. In that sense, it also gives much less protection to rodents and insects and small reptiles, because now they're way more exposed to predatory birds. More than 300 species of bird live in the taiga, either seasonally or permanently. Most of these birds will migrate out of the region for the winter, flying south for food in warmer climates, but about 10% of them will remain and endure the winter. Some of these overwintering bird species include owls, ravens, and a handful of small songbirds. Ground-dwelling animals in the taiga are relatively few and far between compared to the more hospitable biomes like temperate or tropical forests. For example, amphibians and reptiles are relatively rare in the taiga because, by and large, they can't handle the cold. The handful of frogs and salamanders that live in these boreal habitats have some mechanism to hibernate or burrow and hide inside the ground, or go into a deep freeze so as to avoid the cold of winter. The boreal amphibians are known to live in the more swampy parts of the taiga, like wetter land near rivers, lakes, and ponds, and scattered across the tundra. Of the frogs who go into a deep freeze, some of these are wood frogs, and they can survive having most of the water within their bodies literally frozen into ice over the winter. The mechanism for this form of hibernation works on a chemical and cellular level. The frogs build up urea in their tissues instead of removing it as waste. The urea acts as a cryoprotectant, which lowers the freezing point of the fluid in the cells by increasing the concentration of solutes. The high solute concentration allows the solution as a whole to retain a little fluidity, like a gel or kind of like seawater, when it would otherwise be frozen at winter temperatures. The frog can safely freeze more than half the water in its body this way, although it also requires the frog to completely stop all of its metabolic processes. their energy usage becomes near zero, which means they don't move, they don't grow, and they don't heal injuries. The frog's body is a chemical superstructure that basically tries to freeze itself in time, down to the actions of its cells and the movement of its biomolecules. Then, in the following spring, they thaw and reanimate and keep on living. It's pretty insane. Mammals, as opposed to reptiles and amphibians, are able to thrive in the boreal habitats, especially larger mammals or those with thicker fur coats. Larger mammals have a relative advantage in keeping themselves warm. The surface area to volume ratio of larger animals means that they have relatively less surface area exposed to the environment than smaller organisms like beavers and squirrels, per unit volume. Less surface area means less total heat is lost through radiation and convection. Naturally, evolutionary processes were preserved in a few lineages because the larger and larger size offered tangible fitness benefits. It offered a tangible resistance to the cold. This doesn't mean that small animals can't live in the boreal environment, because thousands of them do. I've already mentioned squirrels several times, and beavers, but the boreal forests are also home to foxes and hares, voles, otters, weasels, porcupines, badgers, wolverines, martens, and lynx. Despite their relatively small size, most of these animals are startlingly fast, like the otter, or aggressive if threatened, like the wolverine. Predators like the lynx are a unique and strange cousin in the lineage Felidae, which also includes lions, jaguars, tigers, and your pet cat. Where the lion and tigers are big cats, and your pet cat would be a small cat, the lynx is an intermediate cat, or a middle cat. Lynx usually stand no more than 2 or 2.5 feet tall at the shoulder, making the largest among them as big as a medium-sized dog. I want to take a closer look at one boreal mammal in particular, a charismatic megafauna called the moose. Moose are the largest species in the deer family, larger than elks and reindeer. They generally don't form herds, but will instead roam around the taiga on their own. A mother moose will care for 1 or 2 offspring during their adolescence, which lasts for about 2.5 years, after which they then grow up and move away to live on their own. The moose diet consists of a few plants, like the shoots of willow and birch trees, and they eat various aquatic plants to supplement their diet with sodium. Where a moose travels, it usually leaves behind a trail of maimed and chewed up willow, as it has to eat about 70 pounds a day to maintain its body weight, and if it wants to grow, it has to eat more. Moose are kinda ugly and awkward looking, at least I think so, with a long snout and a big nose, the long legs and knobby knees, but the males possess antlers that can grow to be quite large and really aesthetic, like they look really cool. During the growing period, the antlers are mostly cartilage, but as they age, they turn to bone. Mature antlers are dead, dry bone. They begin growing by coming laterally out of the sides of the skull, and then they reach up and back, and they expand, like a broad palm and fingers spread apart. The antlers get shed every spring, and you might think this is a little strange, because they're such big structures, and they must take a lot of nutrients to grow. And it really is strange, because the antlers of moose and their near relatives are some of the largest ornaments grown by any species. They're an extravagant and nutritionally expensive outgrowth, but they're also extremely important for mating. Antlers work as both a sexual ornament for attracting females, and as a weapon for fighting off other males. The antlers can also be used to fight off predators like wolves or bears, and so they can be used for self-defense. It should be noted, though, that when moose are provoked or antagonized, they can become exceptionally dangerous herbivores themselves. Their antlers are an obvious threat, as an angered bull moose will just bow its head and charge, its antlers' horns pointed straight forward. But they also have long, powerful legs and hard, sharp hooves. Where a horse can make really powerful, backward kicks with its hind legs, a moose can kick with all of its legs, front and back. And it can kick in all directions. It can kick backwards, the front legs can kick forwards, and it can kick out to the side, too. Their long limbs keep them limber and flexible, and this comes in handy when they have to fight off predators or obnoxious humans getting in their personal space. I should make an obligatory note about moose safety. They're pretty common in the northern latitudes of North America, Europe, and Asia, so if you live around them, you've probably seen them one or more times in person. And if you see a mother moose and her offspring, you should get away from them as soon as you can. Female moose can be extremely protective of their offspring, and if you get near the calves, or get between the calf and the mother, she'll become violent. She'll charge and kick and stomp, and people have died from that. Young males are also smart to avoid, as they're flushed with testosterone in their growing phase, and they're really easily pissed off. They're really quick to anger. Naturally, because moose are so big and relatively slow, they're vulnerable to predators. Wolves are the predominant moose predator, which hunt the giant herbivores in packs. Wolves will try to funnel a moose into a kill zone, like towards a stream or a rugged area that's hard for the moose to traverse. And when the moose has been cowed into position, the rest of the hunting party attacks. Sometimes a moose will run away, but other times they'll fight back with charges and kicks. A mature adult moose can make kicks powerful enough to kill a wolf, which turns the hunt into a kind of mortal combat, a primal, naked violence. Sometimes these bloody conflicts can extend over a number of days. As the wolves attack and the moose fights back, it fights them off. The moose will escape, and it might run, slightly wounded for some time before the wolves recuperate and catch up to it again. They'll attack again, they'll wear the moose down. It might fight off the wolves again, and it'll wander for another day, but the wolves will stay on its trail. If the wolves are persistent, then after some time, the wolves will end up killing the moose through exhaustion, or more viscerally, by jumping and biting or clawing at the moose's soft hindquarters. The wolves will tear at the flesh on the thighs, near the groin and the stomach. And because this tissue is soft and heavily vascularized, these wolf attacks, these bites and scratches, can cause massive blood loss. Moose aren't just eaten by wolves, though. They're occasionally attacked and eaten by bears, and sometimes by humans for food or for the antlers, or sometimes both. But all these predators dwell on the land. This is an interesting distinction to make, that they all dwell on the land, because moose even have predators that swim in the ocean. Consider the Pacific coastline of Alaska and Canada. This region is mountainous and rugged, often steeply sloping into the ocean. The cliffs and shoreline are rocky and splintered, with numerous islands all along the coast, and boreal forest clings to these rocky islands. Moose will often try to swim or wade through the water between islands in the search for food, or for a safe area to give birth. They do it all the time. But while swimming or wading, they can be smelled in the water by orcas or killer whales, and these come around and take huge bites out of the moose, maiming it or gutting it and dooming it to a watery death. The killer whale will eat its fill of the moose, and the rest will fall to the ocean floor, where smaller fish and various crustaceans will chew it up. In both the boreal forests of the taiga and the mossy expanses of the tundra, insects play a pivotal role in their local ecology. The low temperatures and the low humidity in boreal climates really suppresses the activity of microbes and bacteria. In warmer climates, these microscopic decomposers would rapidly eat away at any dead plants or animals. A dead plant or animal in the dense wilderness of the tropics is usually completely dissolved and digested by other things in a matter of days. In the boreal environment, however, the ambient conditions suppress the activity of these microbes, and thus, dead stuff lasts for a lot longer. It just lingers. Insects are able to exploit this lingering detritus by feeding off of it en masse, and they're thus major decomposers in the boreal ecosystems. Insects also serve as efficient pollinators for the seasonal flowering plants, because they have such a short growing season that they really need to maximize their opportunity to reproduce, and so capitalizing on insects is a pretty good idea. Most importantly, insects are a stable base for the boreal food web. There are over 32,000 species of insects that live in these northern regions, which feed hundreds of species of birds, amphibians, and fish. Just like the amphibians, the insects tend to dwell in wetter areas near lakes, ponds, bogs, and marshes. Many boreal insects reproduce and lay their eggs in standing water, like the notorious mosquito, and the eggs serve as food for fish and frogs. When they break out of their eggs and mature, they fly around the air and become food for birds and frogs and predatory insects. As you move north, the boreal forests of the taiga become less and less dense, and eventually, there's far more open land than there are trees. This is the sparse taiga, or the open taiga. The farther north you go, the more it transitions from boreal forest to outright Arctic tundra. A telltale sign is that the trees will start to look more gnarled and warped, because as they grew, their branches would get pushed and twisted by the constant wind. These malformed trees, often stripped of leaves by the wind, are called krumholz or krumholz. As you keep going north, the trees will eventually end at the tree line or the timber line, which is the northernmost latitude that the trees can grow. Beyond this, a number of factors prevent tree growth. The soil is too poor in nutrients, and it's spread too thinly across the ground to support trees. The air is too cold, with not a single month having an average temperature warmer than 10 degrees Celsius, which is just 50 degrees Fahrenheit. It's really not that warm. The tundra is so cold that you could be under a cloudless sky at noon in the middle of summer, and the hottest it's going to get is a balmy 60 or 65 degrees. If your first thought is, well, that's not that cold, you have to consider the wind chill, which really brings the fun down a notch. It's always there, always blowing across the landscape, unimpeded by forest or hillside. No seedling tree has the strength or the endurance to withstand days of wind that can be as fast as 50 to 100 kilometers per hour. Another reason trees can't grow here is that the tundra is mostly composed of permafrost, which is ground that's frozen for most or all of the year, because the ambient air temperature is usually near or below freezing, and the summer sunlight is too brief and too weak to thaw the ground. Anywhere from 1 to 3 feet below the surface, the ground is frozen solid, creating an impenetrable lower barrier under the peat soil. This is the permafrost. It necessarily also creates a shallower blanketing layer of warmer soil that extends from the top of the permafrost to the soil surface. Unfortunately, this layer of unfrozen soil cannot support larger trees that grow deep roots, and it typically can't even support trees that are used to shallower soils, like the conifers in the taiga. The permafrost also influences water distribution across the landscape. Liquid water can't sink below the frozen soil, so it accumulates in the warmer upper layer as lakes, ponds, and bogs, and so the soil itself is usually pretty soggy. As the tundra is dotted with many thousands of these little lakes and bogs, it's often swarming with insects. Along the northern coastlines of Russia, Canada, and Alaska, the tundra is haunted by literal black clouds of mosquitoes and gnats and whatever else that lives and breeds in the shallow pools of standing water that just cover the tundra. These lakes, ponds, and bogs also sap the heat right out of the air, robbing a summer day of its warmth by cooling the wind. Okay, so trees can't grow in the tundra because it's just all around terrible. It's cold, it's dark, the soil is thin and weak, and most of it is permafrost that can't even be tapped for water or nutrients in the first place. So that leaves the question, what can grow here? The ground in the tundra is not dissimilar from a montane grassland. The tundra is covered in grasses, sedges, shrubs, lichens, and the characteristic sphagnum moss. These little plants, these tiny fungus, and these puny little algae symbiotes create a thin carpet of living fuzz over the landscape. This organic fuzz layer is food for a small number of grazing species, like caribou, Arctic hares, lemmings, and muskox. In the case of caribou, massive herds of them migrate across the tundra, moving in search of more food whenever they eat up all the lichen in a given area. The muskox are pretty interesting. because they roam in small bands or groups, about 1 to 2 dozen, and these have dominance hierarchies that are based on age. Muskox play around with this dominance dynamic a lot. The older, more dominant ones will occasionally show off their status by walking by and casually kicking or charging a lower-ranking individual just to mess with them. They'll even humiliate them by mounting them and humping in a mock imitation of sex, like, "Ha, this is what I can do to you." The lower-ranked individuals will occasionally fight back. This is all to express dominance over each other, because that's how their social hierarchy works. A particularly interesting fact is that when a predator threatens them, they have a really unusual but effective defensive strategy. The bulls will face the threat, with the younger males and the rest of the females grouped side by side next to them, and together they form some or all of a circle. They literally use their bodies like shields in a phalanx, or as pillars in a wall. The offspring, the young and helpless calves, are protected behind this wall of muscle and fur. This is really cool and fascinating, because the muskox forming a protective ring around their offspring reminds me of a cell membrane enclosing and protecting the molecules of DNA. The offspring are the newest permutations of the muskox gene pool, and they kind of represent procreation, the combining of two mature individuals' genomes into a new one. I think it's this heavy emphasis on DNA that makes me think of the muskox defensive ring as a lot like a cell membrane or a cell wall. They both keep out dangerous things, like predators and unhealthy chemicals, and they both fundamentally serve to protect the DNA, or in the case of the muskox, the manifestation of newly forged DNA, that is, the young muskox calf. Traveling further north across the tundra would take an explorer to the northern coastlines of the world's continents. The northern Alaskan and Russian coasts generally run around close to the 70-degree latitude line, with only a blunt peninsula and archipelago reaching out of central Russia to about 80 degrees north. The Canadian Shield, however, the huge expanse of rocky islands and cold water inlets that defines the deep Canadian North, that reaches up past 80 degrees north, as does the Greenland subcontinent. At these upper reaches of the world, life has to adapt to harsh polar climates. Where the tundra typically has at least 1 month with an average temperature warmer than 0 degrees Celsius, the polar ice caps don't have a single month with an average temperature above freezing. Both the North and South Poles have these unforgiving climates, but there are several key details that differentiate them. The North Pole exists over the ocean. There's no land there at all, only a massive, floating ice sheet. But that ice sheet is getting progressively smaller every year as the world's climate gets warmer. The water at the North Pole also mediates the temperature, preventing it from getting too cold in the winter and too hot in the summer. The South Pole, on the other hand, exists over land. Frozen, deeply continental land with no liquid water for hundreds of miles in any direction. As a result, the heart of Antarctica is extremely cold, one of the coldest places on the planet, impenetrable to almost all life. But interestingly enough, life does live on Antarctica, just not that much of it. But the life that does live here is extreme, as it's forced to be by the extreme environment. I mean, there are strains of bacteria that have been found thriving hundreds of meters below the surface of the ice, in the ice. That's crazy. About 2% of the Antarctic landmass isn't covered in ice, but is instead covered in a cold, thin soil spread across fields of bare minerals. The few plants that eke out a life here include about 125 species total of liverworts and mosses, mostly mosses, but only 3 species of flowering plant. One is a bluegrass, another is hairgrass, and the third is a kind of pearlwort. Because of the rotation of the Earth, only a few weeks at the height of summer provides enough light for the plants to conduct photosynthesis and grow. For the rest of the year, they're dormant or in a kind of stasis. What's really interesting is that despite this weak selection of plants, Antarctica hosts more than 1,100 species of fungus. About 400 of these species form symbiotic relationships with algae to create lichen, while the rest are free-living fungi that grow on rocks and in the thin, cold soil. All of these fungus were forced by circumstance to adapt to the extreme cold and the brutal aridity of Antarctica, which has made them extremely hardy. They have enzymes and metabolic processes that still function, and tissue that can remain healthy at low temperatures. They don't require nearly as much water as any other kinds of fungus elsewhere in the world, and they have cells with thick walls and heavy pigmentation that protects them and their DNA from the sun's UV radiation, which is much stronger at the poles. There are also some fungus that can grow on the fecal waste of all the terrestrial animals, like penguins and a few other flightless Antarctic birds. But besides these, though, there really just aren't any big creatures that live on Antarctica. There are other animals, they're just really small or microscopic, like ticks and lice. Krill swim in the ocean water, and they actually have a really big role, because they support the entire Antarctic food chain. They're the base of the marine food chain in the Antarctic waters. Krill are consumed by mammals like whales, fur seals, and leopard seals, by birds like penguins and albatross, by various species of ice fish, and squid. The seals and penguins are hunted by orcas, and the squid are hunted by larger whales. Many species of birds fly over the coastal waters around Antarctica, hunting for fish. It's a straightforward, working ecology, but it's spread out and delicate, dependent on a food web of carnivores because there's just no plants to be found. The Arctic habitats, back near the North Pole, are much the same, except these have also had indigenous human populations moving through them, settling in them and hunting and foraging. Much of the life in the Arctic are the toughest species in the taiga that can spread even farther north, like mosses and grasses, and animals like caribou, lemmings, Arctic hares and Arctic foxes, wolverines, squirrels, and even wolves and grizzly bears. In the oceans, there are fatty mammals like orcas and baleen whales, belugas and narwhals, and other aquatic species like squid. Seals and walrus live both in the water and on land, depending on their mood and their current activities. They tend to hunt in the sea, where they can move faster and more gracefully, and they tend to flop onto a rock on the beach somewhere to relax and sunbathe. The largest predator in the biome is the polar bear, which is a fearsome and aggressive predator that can reach up to 1,500 pounds. The polar bear spends its time on or near sea ice, which it uses as a platform for hunting bearded seals and ringed seals. When a seal is caught, the adult will usually consume all of the fat and the skin, because these tissues are really calorie dense and they're easy for the older animal to digest, while the younger, still growing polar bears will prefer the meat because it gives them the proteins that they need for their growing bodies. Younger and smaller polar bears are often forced to scavenge the kills of other bears, as they can't yet effectively compete for food. In times of food stress, polar bears will turn to other sources of food like caribous and foxes, even though these are a little harder to catch, and in extreme cases they'll resort to cannibalism. Hungry and aggressive boars, male polar bears, are known to fight or chase off females so they can get a chance to eat their cubs. Besides the mother protecting her offspring during their adolescence, polar bears live solitary lives out on the ice, roaming around a white landscape under a gray sky, hunting in cold, black water. Around people, polar bears are fearless. They don't consider us a threat, and if they're sufficiently antagonized, they'll attack and eat a human with no hesitation. Due to climate change, the available sea ice for polar bears to use while hunting has diminished, and this means the species as a whole can't access as much food as they could in years past, and this has made them hungry, and several polar bear subpopulations are actually starting to decline as starvation sets in. A hungry polar bear will actively pursue any person that it sees and attempt to eat them. Consider black bears, which will typically run from a threatening human. Now consider brown bears, which, if you're threatening them, they'll typically attack you and viciously maul you, but they'll get bored and leave before you're dead. They'll leave you to limp away or bleed out. The polar bears are particularly brutal because if you're threatening them or if they see you and they're hungry or if you really just get in their way, they'll viciously maul you, just tear you apart, and they won't stop until you're dead. They don't stop. They will eat everything they find. That's because food is hard to come by in the Arctic, and it forges these bears into merciless killing machines. To them, you're just food that hasn't been caught yet. Alright, well, that was fun, but it's pretty much all that I have for you on the biomes of the boreal forests, the tundra, and the polar ice caps. I hope you enjoyed this episode, and that you learned something interesting, or that you learned something that made you curious about life in the far northern regions of the world. Next episode, I'll be coming back south, and I'll explore the temperate forest biomes, and the biomes surrounding the Mediterranean Sea. So if that sounds fascinating, be sure to stick around and check it out. And as always, thanks for listening.
Would you like to support the BioLogic podcast? It's super easy. When you open a new episode, press the like button or share it with your friends. If you aren't subscribed, you should hit the subscribe button so you can enjoy a new episode every week. You can also peruse our official store, which has a ton of cool stuff like hand-designed t-shirts, hoodies, and stickers. All the links you need are in the description section below.